Welcome to the most exciting thing happening this night. It is blowing off steam. I'll be your host tonight, Michael Stamatikos, the Associate Professor of Physics and Astronomy at OSU Newark. And Blowing Off Steam is a community-based, open forum, informal discussion series led by local content experts from academia and industry that address topics in science, technology, engineering, art, math, STEAM, that's where we get the STEAM from. And we began this series back in fall of 2017, and we were in Newark at 31 West, we were in Heath at the Coffee Shack, and those were the previous venues with the collaborator, Professor Dev Poling from Ohio University, Zanesville. But ever since fall of 2019, I've had the extreme pleasure of working with my new partners in crime from Denison University, Professor Nestor Matthews, Department of Psychology, and the Granville Public Library's Lucy Chin Parker, Community Engagement Administrator. And they're both in attendance tonight, and I thank them for their efforts. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to hand it over to my colleague Nestor, who will talk to us about next month's installment. Nestor.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We do this on the second Tuesday of each month. So in December, that's going to be December 14th. And we have some special guests with us that evening. At Denison, we've had artists in residence. It's a string quartet, and the string quartet is named Ethel. Ethel will be joining us on December 14th, and we hope that you might come back and join us also. They will be zooming in from their studio in Union City, New Jersey, and they're going to have a live performance for us, but they're also going to be interacting with some Denison faculty and some Denison students, as they always do, being our artist in residence. So again, that's Tuesday, December 14th. It'll be at 7 p.m. here again on Zoom. Hope you can join us. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Nestor. Before I introduce today's main event, I just want to reach out to any students that might be in the universe of over Zoom. And if you want to get credit, please send me your name in the chat, and I will make sure to give you some extra credit for that. Unless you're offended by extra credit, and in that case, we won't give you extra credit. I am very pleased tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tiyi Morris, who's an associate professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at OSU Newark. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Ohio Prison Education Exchange Project and a board member of the Westerville Education Foundation. She earned her BA in African and African American Studies and Liberal Studies from Emory University and a PhD in American Studies History from Purdue University. She's a civil rights historian who studies Black women's social and political activism, whose interdisciplinary research and teaching combine the fields of African American and African Studies, women's, gender and sexuality studies, and American history. Dr. Morris's book, Woman Power Unlimited and the Black Freedom Struggle in Mississippi, available from UGA Press, provides the first comprehensive examination of the Jackson, Mississippi-based organization, Woman Power Unlimited. It is my pleasure to introduce her tonight. Her topic will be Setting the Record Straight, Black Women's Social Justice Activism. Please help me welcome Professor Morris.
All right, thank you, Mike, for the invitation to present in that introduction, and thank you to all of those involved in organizing this event. And special shout out to Emily for having her camera on. Now I feel really bad all the times I've been on a Zoom and not have my camera on. It's really a little odd to present to a bunch of black screens. But tonight I'm going to be talking about really giving a genealogy of Black women's activism. And I'm focusing on this because in thinking about what's happening today, a lot of people are really amazed at the numbers of Black women that are coming to the forefront of the contemporary racial justice movement. But the reality is that Black women have been at the forefront of the Black freedom struggle since its inception, and that Black women today are simply continuing a tradition of Black women's activism that has existed since Black people were brought to this country. And really, to better understand this historical moment, we need to reimagine the roles and experiences of Black women activists. Because Black women's contributions to American society have been consistently overlooked and denied, it's really important to acknowledge and value Black women's contribution and set the record straight in this respect. Yay, thanks Meg for turning on your camera. So we must challenge the traditional historical narrative that presents Blacks in general as passive in our nation's history, with the exceptional Black person thrown in for good measure. Think Harriet Tubman or Martin Luther King Jr. Thanks, Toria. This traditional narrative leaves us with an image of Black people primarily as victims of oppression with no agency or as caricatures of real human beings that are palatable to the white imaginations. Hey, Matthew. A rewriting of the historical record means fully integrating Black people with accurate representations of Black people's lived experiences into the narrative. This will give us a different understanding of our nation because the narrative will be informed by Black people's accurate inclusion. I just realized that I had not shared my screen for my presentation. Okay. And I believe that such a reimagining must begin with Black women because their position of intersectionality has meant that they have experienced some of the worst oppression and greatest marginalization in our society. Intersectionality is a term that speaks to the position of Black women at the intersection of multiple oppressions, such as racism, classism, sexism, and heterosexism, among others. The term was coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in the early 1990s, but the concept dates back to earlier generations of Black women. But Black women's stories are not all doom and gloom. Black women's experiences of oppression and marginalization have led to their being, in many instances, practitioners of a radical humanism that compels them to engage in politics of empowerment for all oppressed people. Black women are the prototype for demonstrating how to live in a world that is hostile to one's existence. Black women viewed themselves as the natural leaders of the struggle because of their special position. This resulted in liberation strategies that stress the centrality of women's activism based on the premise that Black women's liberation will provide freedom for all oppressed people. These beliefs then transform their experiences in terms of institution building, institutional transformation, and resistance, rather than by suppression and marginalization. Black women have demonstrated leadership and perseverance throughout America's history, often in the face of attempts to deny their humanity. So my presentation will explore some of the significant contributions Black women have made to various phases of the Black freedom struggle. And I use the phrase Black freedom struggle really to underscore this generations-long fight for freedom and equality that Black people have been engaged in. So usually when we think about civil rights, people think about the modern civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. But really that was just one iteration of this much longer struggle for Black equality. So then this presentation will provide a genealogy of Black women's activism to demonstrate the organizing tradition that Black women activists today are maintaining. It's also important for us to kind of redefine how we conceptualize leadership. And generally leadership is thought of as reflecting the work of those who are most visible in our historical narrative. And of course, that tends to be men, right? And the best leaders are considered to be those who take on these quote unquote masculine traits of being logical and rational and lacking emotion. And primacy is given to those traits over the feminine ones that women tend to or are supposed to possess. But the reality is that Black women occupied both of those spheres, both the public and the private. And they embodied those characteristics that are seen as masculine leadership skills as well as the feminine ones. And so they have this legacy of activism that is aimed at empowerment and uplift, in which they have been members of the well-known leadership as well as some of the equally important behind the scenes bridge leaders. And the women that I will highlight this evening were race women. They advocated for and fought on behalf of their marginalized sisters and brothers. And these are only a few of the women, the many Black women who have engaged in this work. And although Black women's activism dates back to the period of enslavement and Reconstruction, in the interest of time, I'm beginning with the late 19th century. So historian Rayford Logan termed post-Reconstruction America as the nadir of Black life. It was the period that was characterized by lynching, segregation, disenfranchisement, discrimination, and economic exploitation. Blacks mobilized in a variety of ways to combat whites' use of terror and political machinations to undo the progress that Blacks had made during Reconstruction. Black women understood the need for collective activity to ensure survival, freedom, empowerment, and institutional transformation for Black people. In support of these efforts, they created numerous clubs and organizations, in part because they faced exclusion by both Black men and white women. Two of the coalition organizations of Black women's groups, the Colored Women's League, which was founded in 1892, and the National Federation of Afro-American Women, which was founded in 1895, joined forces in 1896 to create the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which is an organization that is still in existence today. And so this was founded in 1896, and they became the first national Black civil rights organization in the country, predating the NAACP by 13 years. And they undertook a systematic attempt to dismantle racial oppression and white supremacy. And Black women collectively believed that the progress of the Black race depended on the leadership of Black women, and that their womanhood provided the stability and strength for Black people as a whole to draw on. One of the major scholar activists in this movement was Anna Julia Cooper. Cooper was born into slavery in 1858 in Raleigh, North Carolina. And despite being born into this position of subjugation, she had the fortune of attending St. Augustine Normal School and later Oberlin College, from which she obtained both a bachelor's and a master's degree. And one of the things that stood out really early in her education is that she fought to take the gentleman's courses. So she took math and Latin, and she had to do that because it was thought at that time that women's minds were too delicate to take those types of courses. And she went on to get her master's degree in math and became a math teacher. But in 1892, she published A Voice from the South, which is considered to be a seminal text and the first collection of Black women's feminist writings. And she stated in this text, to be a woman of the Negro race in America and to be able to grasp the deep significance of the possibilities of the crisis is to have a heritage unique to the ages, really underscoring her belief in the uniqueness of Black women's intersectional position. But she also felt that this unique position came with a great responsibility. And she's the author of the oft-cited quote, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood. Without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." So for Cooper and her contemporaries, it was the duty of Black women to lead the entire race, men, women, and children, to a higher level of existence. She proposed a holistic doctrine of elevation, which included education, economic self-reliance, and morality, in which Black women were at the forefront. And she undertook this mission through her work with the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, her work as a teacher and as a principal, and later in life as a college president. In 1900, she attended the first Pan-African Conference and presented a paper titled The Negro Problem in America, thus highlighting her connection to people of African descent globally and reflecting Black women's larger humanist focus. A contemporary of Cooper was B WellsBurnett. She was an educator, investigative journalist, and the foremost anti-lynching activist in the country. A Mississippi native, she too was born into slavery just before the Civil War. And she was so radical that she was often at odds with many of her contemporaries. So for example, she was at the convening meeting of the NAACP, but when they pulled together their executive board, they didn't invite her initially to be a member because they thought that she was too radical and would undermine their attempts to make racial progress in the country. In 1884, when she was in her early 20s, she was on the train riding from Memphis to Woodstock, Tennessee. And because of Jim Crow segregation at the time, she was asked to move to the smoking car, which was also the car where Blacks were relegated to sitting, and she refused. And the white conductor attempted to physically remove her from the train, and she bit him and refused to get out of her seat. And then he called white male passengers on the plane to have her removed. She was eventually removed, and she sued Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad and won at the lower level, but then they appealed and that case was overturned. And she was infuriated by this because she, like many Blacks, had looked to the justice system, the legal system to provide some measure of equality for Blacks, and she realized that that simply would not be the case. During her period as an investigative journalist, she began to investigate lynchings, and she would go to the sites of these lynchings and interview people. And in 1892, when she published one of her earlier articles that really exposed the myths behind lynching, her newspaper office was burned down and looted in Memphis, Tennessee. And she happened to be in New York at the time, but whites got out the message that if she came back to Memphis, that she would be killed. So she left Memphis and did not return to the South after that. But in 1892, she also published a few pamphlets, the first of 3 pamphlets about lynching, called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All of Its Phases. And in this text, she explained the mythology of the Black rapist and the use of lynching as a form of domestic terrorism to maintain Black subjugation. And she concluded the pamphlet with a chapter titled Self-Help that outlines strategies Blacks should employ to gain justice and equality. And not surprisingly, one of the strategies she advocated was self-defense. And so this quote, she starts off by explaining that there was one incident of an attempted lynching that didn't occur because the Black people in that community defended themselves. And so she said a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home, and it should be used to give protection, which the law refuses to give. When the white man, who is always the aggressor, knows he runs as great risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim does, he will have greater respect for Afro-American life. The more the Afro-American yields and cringes and begs, the more he has to do so, the more he is insulted, outraged, and lynched. So this position is also important because it demonstrates women embracing a strategy that is typically associated with masculinity and manhood. And Wells also serves as a connecting thread for Black women who have embraced armed self-defense, including Harriet Tubman, Stagecoach Mary, D. Sweets Turnbow, Gloria Richardson, and many women in the Black Panther Party. During the interwar period, Black women worked through organizations such as the National Council of Negro Women, which was founded by Mary McLeod Bethune in 1935 and was later led by Dorothy Height for many years. They continued to engage in club work through their church groups, focusing on issues such as education and institution building within the Black community, societal transformation, and citizenship rights. The National Council of Negro Women, as Bethune described it, was an organization of organizations. So really an umbrella organization for all Black women's organizations. So church groups, political groups, sororities, everything that you can imagine. And she created this organization, even though she had once been president of the National Council of Negro Women, because she saw that organization losing some of its efficacy. It also had a very middle-class orientation, and she wanted to be able to draw on the efforts of working class women as well. And so she envisioned the council as being this group that could really pull together Black women from all walks of life. And so through this organization, Black women worked to increase employment and economic opportunity. They worked to ensure that Blacks were included in the New Deal programs. They worked to end restrictions against Blacks in the armed forces, to end discrimination in public housing, to work for the elimination of the poll tax, which had been keeping Black people from registering to vote. They worked to try to access Social Security benefits for domestic and farm workers, which had been excluded from those New Deal programs, as well as for interracial development and world issues of international peace. And Bethune was also significant because she was the only woman that was included on FDR's Black cabinet. And this was his informal group of Black advisors who counseled him on public policy matters, right? And how to be more inclusive of the needs of Black people. So again, we have Black women at the forefront of all of these issues, working and setting an example and laying a foundation for future generations of Black women. Moving to the civil rights movement, during the 50s and 60s, Black women's social justice work, of course, continued. Although Black women are generally acknowledged as the backbone of the civil rights movement and providers of key support, nonetheless, their contributions are often devalued. Black women engaged in multiple levels of activism, whether behind the scenes or on the front lines, and they were leaders in their communities and in the larger national struggle. So someone everybody knows is Rosa Parks. And Parks has always had a certain level of visibility in our national consciousness, but the image that we have of her is what I would call a caricature. So the account that is typically given is that Rosa Parks was a tired old lady who was too weary to give up her seat on that fateful day in December of 1955. And I'm sure you all heard the phrase that Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and then white folks saw the light and saved the day, right? So this statement, though, is a fiction that really obscures Parks's true role as a civil rights activist. So when she first took her seat on the bus that day, she was actually sitting in the colored section. And what happened is that more whites got on the bus, and as the bus driver had the will to do, he moved the sign. So expanding the white section to accommodate those new whites boarding the bus. And the people who were sitting in the same row as Rosa Parks, they were all asked to get up. And they did, and Rosa Parks did not. And one of the reasons that she didn't get up, that yes, she probably was physically tired from working during the Christmas season, but also she had had an incident with that same bus driver 10 years earlier, that he had kicked her off the bus. And when we think about Black people having to ride the bus at that point, it wasn't simply, you pay and you go to the back of the bus. Black people had to get on at the front of the bus, then they had to get off the bus, and they had to go around and enter through the back door and get back on and sit in the back section of the bus. Bus drivers were known for driving off before people boarded, reboarded, or driving off while they were still reboarding, and people had actually been physically hurt because of that. And so it was the physical fear of having to do that, but also the degradation of having to get on up front to pay and then get off and reboard in the back. And we had, the reality is that there were many Black women who were working as domestic workers who were subjected to these indignities on a daily basis. And so Rosa Parks was simply fed up with being dehumanized at that point. But another important aspect of her previous political work that prepared her for this is that she had for a long time been working with the NAACP. And one of her roles with the NAACP was investigating cases of white men sexually assaulting Black women. And so when there was a case that the NAACP might be involved in, Rosa Parks was often sent to those communities to interview those women to take down their stories. She also attended a workshop at the Highlander Folk School, which was a training ground initially for labor activists, but then became in the 50s and 60s a training ground for civil rights activists. So she had all of that experience up to the sitting down or remaining seated on the bus that day. And that informed her political ideology and why she made that decision at that particular time. Also, this idea that we have of her as being this frail old lady simply isn't true. She was in her early 40s, right? So very much a young enough woman to make that conscious decision and, have been physically capable of getting up had she wanted to. So it's really important to understand, and I included these two pictures with her in front of the microphone because oftentimes we envision her as being passive and quiet and silenced, right? And part of that was the way that she was constructed during the movement by the male ministers. But when we see her that way, again, it erases that previous civil rights activism that she had engaged in. And she was also heavily involved with the Scottsboro Boys case in the 1930s. Again, so this really long history of political activism leading up to the Montgomery bus boycott. And it's important to think about how we include Black women in this historical narrative, and not just that they're included. So it must be done in a way that really honors their lives and their contributions. And historian Herbert Gutman opined that it's not possible to honor people by romanticizing them, which is often what we have done with Parks. Ella Baker is who I want to focus on next. And I think that she is perhaps the most important woman civil rights leader because she directly and indirectly changed the trajectory of the movement. She was born in North Carolina in 1903, and her parents were middle class. Her mother was heavily involved in Black women's activism, and her parents instilled in her the importance of education and community uplift. But instead of pursuing the typical middle-class Black woman's occupation of becoming a teacher, she decided to dedicate her life to social justice efforts. So after college, she moved to New York, and in the 30s and 40s, she worked with the NAACP, the YWCA, the Young Negroes Cooperative League, as well as for school desegregation. And all of this activism and organizing well prepared her for the advent of the civil rights movement. In the 1940s, she became the director of branches for the NAACP, and over a 9-year period, raised their membership or helped to raise their membership from about 50,000 to 450,000 members traveling throughout the South almost on a weekly basis and just going out into communities and talking to people. Shortly after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, when Martin Luther King Jr. was a young 28 years old and Ella Baker was 53, he created the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and asked her to come on to help organize this organization. And she became the interim executive director. Interim because she was a woman and because she wasn't a minister. So all of the other executive leadership positions were held by male ministers. And despite the fact that she was old enough to be their mothers, and that she had decades of organizing experience, they still never really treated her as an equal, right? Because of their own sexism and their own bias about what women's role should be in their organizations. And she talked about this experience of really being ignored, and how she also had a problem with King's leadership style because he was this singular charismatic leader. And she didn't think that that was the appropriate way to lead a movement or an organization, right? She preferred to lead from the sidelines and to really empower people to become leaders themselves. And that's why she often used that phrase, strong people don't need strong leaders. So while she was kind of at odds with SCLC and their leadership in King, she did cajole them into providing money for students to come together. So February 1st, 1960, you had the 4 students from North Carolina A&T sit in at the Woolsworth counter, which sparked students sitting in across the South. And in April of 1960, Ella Baker got money from SCLC to have a conference to bring some of these students together. SCLC thought, great, we'll support this because then we can start a youth chapter of the SCLC that can compete with the NAACP youth chapter. But when they get to the convening, one of the first things Ella Baker tells them is, do not become a part of the SCLC. Become your own organization because your elders will try to control and temper what you are going to do. She wanted them to be an independent, autonomous organization so their radicalism could lead them to the forefront of the movement. And she knew that if they were connected with SCLC, from what she had seen, that they would stymie the radicalism and imagination of the young people. And so they took her advice and they really saw her as a mentor, a facilitator, a guide who shaped the development of the organization. And that's why I consider her to be perhaps the most important woman civil rights leader, because she was the midwife to SNCC. And she set them on this path to really model this beloved community that they were trying to create. And she allowed these young people to practice, she helped them in practicing gender equity, and kind of living outside the box and really living in community and empowering people to do the things that would change their lives. And there are many people today who are still using Ella Baker's ideology as a platform for their organizations. And she possessed really this idea again of a radical humanism that led her to fight for the rights of all oppressed people as she was seeking to empower the most dispossessed. And she says that she was able to do this because her ego wasn't at stake. And again, contrasting her leadership style with the leadership style oftentimes of the male figures that we tend to associate with civil rights activism. I'm going to go a little more quickly. I see I'm already at 24 minutes, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Clary Collins Harvey was another civil rights activist. She founded an organization called Woman Power Unlimited that was based in Jackson, Mississippi, and this organization is the focus of my book. And this organization was created to support the Freedom Riders initially, who had come to Jackson in 1961. And she was able to create this organization and be openly active in part because she was a business owner. So she owned Collins Funeral Home, and that meant that all her clientele was Black. So she didn't have to worry about, whites taking away their business from her because of her activism. She didn't have to worry about loans because this was a business that was passed down to her from her parents. And so she had creditors outside of the state. And so she had the economic freedom to openly participate in the movement. And the same was true of other members of her executive team. So Thelma Sanders was a business owner. She owned her own boutique and she became the vice chair of the organization. And she ended up opening her own business because one day she went to a store, and during this time, during the Jim Crow South, Black people couldn't try on clothes in stores. You just had to simply buy something and hope that it fit. And so one day she went to a store to buy a house coat and she was told she couldn't try it on. And the manager called over a white sales clerk to try on the robe for her so she could see how it fit. And she left and she was just like, enough is enough. This is really the last time I'm going to do this. So she created her own boutique so Black women wouldn't be subjected to those indignities. And so again, since her clientele was all Black, she had the freedom of participating openly in the movement as well. And the same thing for AME Logan, who was the secretary of the organization. She was actually a traveling saleswoman who sold Black cosmetics or cosmetics from a Black-owned company that was based in Detroit. So again, all of these women had economic freedom and flexibility that allowed them to model participation for other middle-class women to kind of really legitimize participating openly in the movement. They also were well-known activists in their communities, working with the NAACP, working through their churches and working with their club women's groups. And so they were well-known and they were respected individuals, already leaders in their local community. So when the opportunity came for them to engage in civil rights activism, they could bring in a lot of people to work with them. And they engaged in not just supporting the freedom riders and other civil rights activists through housing, providing clothing, feeding them, but they did some of the mainstays of civil rights activism, like working for school desegregation and registering people to vote. But they also did some kind of innovative things. So they worked on issues of world peace. They participated in Women's Strike for Peace. They participated with the National Council of Negro Women in creating a project called Wednesdays in Mississippi, where they would bring middle-class women down to Mississippi during the summers of 1964 and 1965 to see what was happening on the ground in these communities so those individuals could go back home, these were prominent women, and really generate interest and support for civil rights projects in the South. They were really willing to take any course of action that they could to support the movement, so they did a lot of behind the scenes work, but again, they were also prominent leaders within their community, other mothering the civil rights activists, and really demonstrating a way to engage in activism that met the needs of all their constituents. And so with women like these, women like Miss Logan and Miss Harvey and Ella Baker, you can see why SNCC was so radical. So they had this kind of other mothering community of older women who were nurturing and encouraging their radicalism. SNCC was the largest civil rights organization, and under their guidance, while not perfect, it was one of the most equitable. And women had much more prominent leadership roles. And one of these individuals was Diane Nash. She was born in Chicago and attended Fisk University in Tennessee, and initially attended some of James Lawson's nonviolent workshops. And from there, she became heavily involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And when the Freedom Riders, who had planned this journey from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, and if many of you, I'm sure, have seen the images of the burned out bus, that those initial Freedom Riders wanted to cancel the ride because of the violence that they were met with in Alabama. And that initial group actually ended up flying to New Orleans. But Nash led a contingent of SNCC activists actually saying that if we allow violence to stop this movement, then they will know that they can always use violence to stop us. And they were willing to die. They knew they might die. But she led these students and they continued the the rides to Jackson, Mississippi. And in May of 1961, that is the impetus for Woman Power Unlimited being created. And so after the Freedom Rides, though, it became this bedrock principle that you don't allow the actions that you're engaged in to be suppressed by violence, right? And so this is why we see those numerous images of people being sprayed with fire hoses. There's numerous church bombings and disappearances, beatings and killings, because SNCC, primarily SNCC, some other organizations, but primarily SNCC, simply refused to placate and succumb to the violence of white retaliation. During this time of the Freedom Rides, she was charged with contributing to the delinquency of minors, the individuals that she had encouraged to ride on the buses, and she faced a 2.5 year sentence while she was 6 months pregnant. And so the judge didn't know that she was pregnant. And when she shows up to court with this big belly, she decided to accept the charges. And she said that this will be a Black baby born in Mississippi, and thus wherever he is born, he will be in prison. If I go to jail now, it may hasten the day when my child and all children will be free. But the judge ended up not giving her this 2.5-year sentence, and ultimately gave her a sentence of 10 days, which she served in the Jackson County Jail. And she was also heavily involved in organizing around the Selma March. And so we see that women were on the front lines, young women, older women, both locally and nationally. Gloria Richardson, a civil rights activist, but she was really unique because she was a bit older. She had a close collaboration with SNCC, but she was 41 at the time that she led this movement. And she, unlike most Southern activists, was unwilling to accept nonviolence as a way of life and a strategy. She actually just died earlier this year. But the Cambridge movement that she led had an economic focus. And again, it was distinct from the other civil rights movements in the South because she actually embraced self-defense as a strategy. And she became one of the most feared and militant leaders of the struggle and laid a foundation and really was a bridge between the civil rights and Black Power movements. Thinking about Black Power, Eli Brown was a member of the Black Panther Party. She ran for the city council in Oakland in 1973 and got 30% of the votes. But what was even more important was the amount of individuals that they registered to vote. So between November of 1972 and March of 1973, they registered 14,000 people to vote. When Huey P. Newton, who was one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, fled to Cuba in 1974, Brown assumed the position of chair of the organization until 1977. And she was adept at both presenting the politics of respectability that was necessary for the public face of the organization, as well as the masculine posturing that she needed in order to maintain order in an organization that was still hyper-masculine. And under her leadership, she strengthened the Black Panther Party's engagement in electoral politics, and she aided in the election of Oakland's first Black mayor, Lionel Wilson. Her activism was an excellent example of the evolution and adaptation of Black Power and the need as an activist to understand the importance of meeting the immediate needs while simultaneously engaging in long-term strategizing about gaining power for people within the system. And she continues her work for prisoners' rights and juvenile justice. So between civil rights and Black Power and today's Black Power mobilization, there were several Black women's organizations, including, but this is definitely not all of them, the Third World Women's Alliance, which began as the Black Women's Liberation Committee, which was a caucus within SNCC that focused on this triple jeopardy that Black women were experiencing. The Boston-based Combahee River Collective that was founded in 1974. Critical Resistance, which is an international movement to end the prison industrial complex, which of course disproportionately incarcerates Brown and Black people, was founded in 1997 by Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Rose Brass. And then Insight, Women of Color, which was founded in 2000 to fight against state and domestic violence against women. So it's important to recognize these organizations because the legacy of activism they carried on is still being carried on by women today. In 2013, Black Lives Matter began as a social media hashtag that would shortly after evolve into a movement with Black feminist politics as its ideological bedrock. And when we look at the creators of Black Lives Matter, we see three Black women, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, who brought their experiences of intersectionality into shaping a movement to address the needs of the Black community. And even behind the scenes, Black women are the vanguard, grounding their activism in a humanism and inclusiveness that is the only true foundation on which justice can be actualized. Other organizations in the 21st century that are imagining and working toward Black feminist futures are Project Nia, which was founded in 2011 by Miriam Kaba. And the organization's mission is to end the arrest, detention, and incarceration of children and young adults by promoting restorative, transformative justice practices. And at the forefront of abolitionist organizing, Kaba was deeply involved in the efforts in Chicago to obtain justice for Black men who were tortured by the police in the 70s, 80s, and 90s under the leadership of John Burge. And the city actually awarded reparations to those victims in 2015. Blackout Collective is a Black women-led radical direct action organization, and they help create and build other organizations by providing on-the-ground action support and training. And this organization was founded in 2014 in Oakland in the height of the Ferguson uprisings. Assata's Daughter is an organization in Chicago that mobilizes young people by providing them with political education, leadership development, mentorship, as well as resources. So kind of modeling off of the Black Panther Party that provided, the free breakfast program and the free grocery program. In our community of Newark, in thinking about Black women organizing around Ohio, we continue to see Black women leaders emerge. So Jamie Holderman was the co-founder of the Community Alliance for Racial Justice in Newark. And in Westerville, where I live, Vashita Johnson is the executive director and was one of the founders of the newly established organization, We Rise for Greater Westerville. So there are many organizations in many ways where Black women are still at the forefront of this racial justice initiatives. And so we see through this genealogy that Black women's leadership has been consistent and invaluable to advancing justice for Blacks and other minoritized people. And they have given us a model for engaging in holistic democratic movement building. And so then my advice to people is to really trust and follow the leadership of Black women. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Feel free to either unmute your mic and vocalize your question, or you can type your question in the chat and I will read that. And if you came in late and you're my student from Astronomy 1143, please send me your name in the chat to give you credit. You can also raise your hand if you want, and I can call on you like we're in class.
Hi, Dr. Dwayne.
Hi, Dwayne.
I'm your extra credit phenom here.
Yes.
Great instructional from Miss Morris. Outstanding.
Thank you.
Yep, I appreciate it. I'm a psychology major, so the more diverse I am, I think the better informed I will be. So. Very surprising on Rosa Parks, though. I didn't know she was that young. They always put her out to be just a kind of a helpless old lady who just kind of was tired. I don't know. I just very intriguing. I like that. Very surprising to me.
Yeah, what I usually tell my students is that I'm older than she was when she got arrested, and that gets lots of looks because it also makes them rethink how, they think I am.
Yes, thank you.
So maybe I can offer a question here. First, thank you for a wonderful overview. I learned so much. I'm not exactly sure where to start with my questions, but I'll start earlier on in the talk. You were, I believe, one of the earlier persons that you were highlighting was Anna Julia Cooper, and talking about a voice from the South. And what I thought was interesting was, as your talk went on, we were seeing many more recent movements that a lot of the viewers here tonight would be familiar with. And of course, they can communicate by social media, but that wasn't always the case. So I'm old enough to predate social media. But even in my college years, we would have had email. Okay? But before that, we would have had telephone. But back in 1892, as some of these organizations are trying to get together, it's interesting to me to think about how they would get the word out about themselves. Right? They didn't have many of the mechanisms that we had, and maybe women of color had even fewer opportunities there to use newspapers or something like that. So I'm wondering how in the 1890s the word was distributed about the associations that were forming.
The Black press was a primary method. I don't remember the numbers, but there were significantly more Black papers back then than there were today. And that was the primary way to disseminate information. And then also these pamphlets, like the one that Ida B. Wells produced about lynching, and they would circulate within the Black community. And there would be conventions, right? So the Colored Women's League that was founded in 1892 was a coalition of 82 women's organizations. And the National Federation of Afro-American Women was a coalition of about 115. And so when those organizations were brought together, and of course, more local clubs were created, that was another way to simply transmit this information. So you have a convention and then everybody takes it back to their communities. Yeah.
Very good.
But I really do, I mean, I love to point that out to students that we have so many ways of disseminating information so quickly today. Think about all of those, you know, individuals, generations previously and what they had to do to disseminate information that we can just do with a click of a button, right? Even during the civil rights movement, we think about the Montgomery bus boycott and how Joanne Robinson Gibson, who was a professor at, I forget what school she taught at, a historically Black college, but she and her students were up the night before mimeographing the flyers to hand out. And a mimeograph machine was this thing that you had to crank. I mean, I remember from elementary school and it had that purple ink with a funny smell, but you couldn't just push a button and copy it, you know, make 1,000 copies, right? They were literally hand turning this thing to make copies the night before. So there was an additional labor component that was necessary for mass mobilization in these earlier periods.
If I can just maybe add on to Nestor's question, what fascinates me now is, you know, do you think with the advent of social media, with the unsanitized ability of video and audio to be shared so quickly, do you think that how would that have changed the movement if we sped that up 50 or 100 years? Do you think it would have mattered, or do you think society needed to kind of grow into something that would be receptive? And the thing I'm thinking about, of course, is the tragedy of George Floyd and the power of that video that I think was critical to get justice. I mean, I don't know how that would have played out if that evidence wasn't there, for example.
Right. So it's important to think about and really understand that every generation has its forms of technology and media, right? So even though in the 1800s, late 1800s, it was, you know, newspapers, by the civil rights movement in the 1960s, it is television and radio. And so these images are actually getting out. The media is really important to kind of deconstructing the misinformation that was being put out by Southern whites. And so when people can actually see on TV, people being sprayed with hoses and, you know, little kids having dogs sicked on them, that did a lot to mobilize support for the movement. And the press was still important. So Emmett Till's murder, right? His mother decided to have that open casket and the picture was in Jet magazine. And my mother remembers to this day that she got the mail that day and it was right in the center. And when it opened up, that's the first thing she saw and she dropped it and screamed, right? And so the effect that social media is having today and disseminating these images, it had a similar effect, you know, back then. It was just a different form of media. I do think in some ways people are relying too heavily on social media. I mean, you can tweet out information and post Instagram pictures about a movement or a demonstration or a protest event, but that doesn't allow for the type of community building that is necessary to create accountability to each other and to the movement. If everybody's just out kind of doing their own thing and trying to, you know, when I see people in protest dancing in front of cops so they can have this great Instagram picture, it just makes me wonder, you know, what is your end goal? To whom are you accountable and why are you doing that? You know, and so I think that in some ways, social media has fostered kind of a disingenuous effort to participating for some individuals in this social movement. And we have to really work around, you know, just sending out information to 1,000 people isn't the same as doing that on the ground community building work that is necessary to sustain a movement.
Thank you. Other questions?
Not hearing any others for the moment. I had one more. I have to confess, I had not heard before tonight. This is just my ignorance. I had not heard that FDR had a Black cabinet. And I'm wondering, maybe prior presidents or perhaps governors had also engaged in having Black cabinets, but I hadn't heard that before. And I wonder if FDR was among the first to do that, or if that was fairly common in those decades.
He was. Previous presidents would have an advisor or two. So Booker T. Washington served as an advisor. Frederick Douglass, even before him, served as an advisor. But again, it would just be one or two individuals. FDR was the first one to have this official and publicly known, even though it was informal, Black cabinet. Yeah. And I would say that I think part of that was due to Eleanor Roosevelt's push as well.
Oh, okay.
Because she was actually friends with Mary McLeod Bethune and then later Dorothy Height.
Wow. Very interesting.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Morris. I too have a lot of questions that I took some notes and I'm dreaming stuff up as we go. But curious in terms of your presentation and the layout of your book. I've not had a chance to read it but got to witness your presentation around foregrounding the lives of particular Black women activists alongside the organizations and the movements they were building. And I'm curious if the thought behind leading with the individuals or the collective, if you grappled with that as you were framing your book, to really emphasize what came across so clearly in your presentation, which is that connection, that collective, that movement forward that these strong Black women activists were promoting. So I was just thinking or curious about your book, whether you led with the individuals or the organizations, or if you grappled with that relationship at all.
That is such a good question, because the book is about the organization, but it really centers Miss Harvey. Not just because she was the founder, but because she donated her papers to the Amistad Research Center at Tulane University. And her papers are extensive. She was also the first Black woman to be president, and I think the first Southern woman to be president of Church Women United, which was, an organization of over 30,000 women. And so she was very prominent in all the work that she did, especially as a Black woman business owner during that time. And she was very aware of her position and what she was doing. And so she had the foresight to document everything and to save it all. No other woman in the organization had done that. So by default, she kind of emerged, at the center of the narrative for the organization and for the book. And it speaks to a problem of doing research on Black women activists and Black women in general, because there is this hesitancy to donate people's records, to keep papers, because people are afraid of how their stories are going to be presented to the public and interpreted, right? If we think about particularly women from that generation earlier who were witnessing Black women being, denigrated in the public and just wanting to protect themselves and to protect their stories. I was able to interview Mrs. Logan before she passed. I interviewed Jessie Mosley, who was another woman in the organization before she passed, as well as their children and some of the younger members of the organization. But again, Mrs. Harvey was the only one who had papers. And so it kind of dictated the way I told the story. But I also think it's important to have that individual perspective to see what shaped them, right? So if we think about Rosa Parks, if we don't know that history, then we don't know why she did what she did on that particular day. If we don't know, what prompted Mrs. Sanders to open her own boutique that positioned her to be so open in the movement, then we really lose a part of what shaped their experiences and what prompted them to engage in this work. Yeah. And then also in thinking about Black women's organizations, for Harvey in particular, the way that she structured the organization is that she had been involved in the NAACP and other male-dominated spaces and was really critical, kind of like Ella Baker, of the bureaucratic and hierarchical structures of organizations that pushed women to the margins. And she wanted to create a movement that was flexible, that didn't have membership fees or dues, that accounted for women having childcare responsibilities, all those things that could increase the participation of Black women in this organization. So those are also the things that feminist organizing brings to social justice work.
I had a question. I was wondering what you kind of think about the tension between like highlighting the work that Black women have done for these movements, and also kind of like going too far and almost creating this like stereotype of the Black woman as like the strong woman who it's her responsibility to do these things, to lead, to be the other mother for an organization. Kind of like, what's like the balance between those kinds of things?
Another really good question, right? Because there is that prevailing stereotype about Black women, you know, making a way out of no way, always taking care of everybody. And when we think about those women at the turn of the 20th century, saying that they are the leaders of the race, you know, it was upon them that the race was going to be revived and progress was going to be made. I mean, they were taking a big task on their shoulders, right? And what would happen if they fell? And of course, they weren't as successful as they had hoped. And I think that in all of those earlier iterations of social justice movements, nobody in general was really engaging in self-care to the degree that they should. Now, interestingly, Rosa Parks practiced yoga. Someone just wrote a book about that. And Mrs. Harvey also practiced yoga. And she actually had a whole holistic living company. Because I also interviewed a woman who worked as her assistant and helped partner with her in this healthcare company. And she focused on massages and colon cleanses and all types of stuff in the 60s and 70s that just were not typical like they are today. But I think by and large, that self-care component wasn't there. And we see in SNCC a lot of PTSD, because basically it's like they were at war. They were literally living in a battle zone, those people living in the communities in Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama. And so I think that Black women continue to struggle with that. And we can really see that when we think about, say, the anti-lynching movement, right? The primary victims of lynching were Black men. We think about police brutality today or the abolitionist movement, the primary victims are Black men, yet Black women are at the forefront of those struggles. And it's also psychologically difficult because oftentimes Black women don't feel as though that care is reciprocated with respect to Black men being on the forefront of struggles like reproductive rights struggles, right, for Black women. And so it just creates an even greater emotional toll. And I think that activists today are doing a better job of trying to balance those stereotypes and engage in self-care, and then restorative justice within communities of activists themselves, right? Because harm is not just coming from external forces, but it's also happening internally when we think about transphobia and sexism. And so really being mindful and intentful about harm reduction within those activist spaces. But there is still definitely that emotional burden.
Really great questions. We have time for maybe one more. We're just under the 8 o'clock hour.